Thank you, Fred, for that introduction. In our second session, having introduced the beginning of written prophecy in the north, in Israel, during the 8th century before the Common Era, we're going to consider what happened when prophecy migrated south by considering its two most prominent examples, the prophet Micah and the prophet Isaiah. It's during this period, when prophecy moved south, that it achieved its classic voice within the biblical tradition. First, we need to consider why the move. And the answer to that question comes out directly from what we considered last week as we looked at the examples of both Amos and Hosea. It was in the north that the corruption of the capital there had caused the two northern prophets of Israel, Amos and Hosea, to oppose the entire system, root and branch, and to claim that the threat that was coming from the Assyrian Empire represented the vengeance of Yahweh. Very often, the prophetic voice can seem to modern ears as if it is a random expression of rage. And there's no doubt about it, some of what they say reminds me of the old film Network. I'm mad as hell, and I'm not going to take it anymore. But there's a difference. Namely, the character in Network, this was part of the comedy of that film, was angry simply about the way he himself was personally treated. The point of prophecy as it emerged in Israel, that northern kingdom that had rebelled against the south, was that the way that people were being unjust had provoked the wrath of Yahweh, so that their call was not self-interested nor simply petulant. It was a matter of addressing a moral imperative to the people around them. They had to oppose other prophets who stood up in favor of the regime in Samaria and who thought it was perfectly all right to defend what those people were doing who were knocking together fields, expropriating property, and forcing greater poverty upon many in Israel. In that battle, the results of the Assyrian invasion of 722 before the Common Era seem to be decisive, at least from the point of view of the reputation of the prophets. Because, as I mentioned last week, between 722 and 721, the Assyrians in fact did destroy Samaria, as Amos and Hosea had said would be the result if they persisted in their injustice. The most prominent parts of the population were either killed or exiled. Many parts of the entire demographic had shifted as there was a movement of people living in Israel out to other parts of the Assyrian Empire, while other populations were brought in to Old Israel. This is what gave the name Galilee of the Nations to Galilee of the Nations. It wasn't born that way, it was made that way by the Assyrians. The only reason we have prophecy as it emerged within the biblical tradition is that it was when they were active in the north that Amos and Hosea provided for the writing down of their prophecies. That was the major shift between the oral and the written movement. And because it was now in writing, it was possible for there to be this transfer from the wealthier, more powerful nation, Israel, in the north, to Judah in the south. Everything that we're considering today results from the way in which that movement of written prophecy was absorbed in the kingdom of Judah. Now, of course, in absorbing the message of the north, the targets of the prophecy had to change. It could no longer be Samaria. Now, Jerusalem was directly engaged. And you can see that in the first example for us to treat in this session, the prophet Micah, he appreciated exactly this change of azimuth from the attack on Samaria to the threat to Jerusalem. He prophesied, "Her heads judge for a bribe." You may remember the words of Amos from last week. "And her priests guide for hire." You may remember the words of Hosea from last week. What's going on here is that the northern prophecy has been metabolized for the south. Her heads judge for a bribe, and her priests judge for hire. Her prophets divine for silver. Now we're getting introduced the idea of professional prophets who are operating, believe it or not, for gain. Yet they rely on Yahweh, saying, "Is not Yahweh in our midst? Evil shall not come upon us. Therefore, because of you, Zion will be plowed as a field, and Jerusalem shall be a heap of ruins, and the mountain of the heights a forest." Precisely that direct imperative of destruction that we saw in Amos and Hosea is picked up within Micah. And in addition to the general charges that are introduced here in chapter 3, already in the previous chapter, Micah has specified many of the same economic injustices which had been in the minds of the northern prophets. He writes in chapter 2, verse 2, "They covet fields and seize them, and houses, and take them away. They oppress a man and his house, a man and his inheritance. Therefore, thus says Yahweh, behold, against this family I am devising evil, from which you cannot remove your necks." As the prophecy opens, Micah's position appears to be that there will be no possibility of an alternative to destruction because of the injustice that's been going on in Jerusalem. And that is the reason for which he has to set his face against other prophets, those who also declare that they are speaking in Yahweh's name. "Thus says Yahweh concerning the prophets," again in chapter 3, "who lead my people astray, who cry peace when there is no peace, but they have something to eat, but declare war against him who puts nothing in their mouths. Therefore it shall be night to you without vision, darkness to you without divination." So Micah reveals that he's dealing with an alternative group of prophets, also claiming inspiration, and at the same time also accepting payment for their oracles. It obviously raises the question, which several of you have put to me over lunch today, what makes a prophet a prophet? And we're going to see that precisely because of this combat in Jerusalem during the 8th century, between different groups of prophets, that issue of what makes for a prophetic commission became extremely prominent. And we'll see it very clearly addressed when we come to our next book, to the book of Isaiah. For the moment, however, I want to call attention to another seam of prophecy that's operating within Micah. On the one hand, there is the straight call for social justice paired with the threat of destruction. But the other seam has to do with a possibility alongside destruction of there being an extraordinary widening of the orbit of Yahweh's influence. Micah is the first prophet to express the words, "It shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the Lord of hosts shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and shall be raised above the hills, and people shall flow to it. Many nations shall come and say, Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and we may walk in his paths. And he shall judge between many nations, and decide for strong nations afar off. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore." Alongside the prophecy of destruction, there is also the prophecy of renewal, but a renewal, you notice, not limited to Jerusalem. Jerusalem is instead the hub of a renewal, which is to include all nations. Now, this note of profound hopefulness that Micah introduced into his prophecy resulted in this book being used at a later time also to prophesy the coming of a Messiah. Within the prophecy of chapter 4 of the mountain of the Lord being exalted above all other nations, although this judgment is indeed final, there's no need for a Messiah, Davidic or otherwise, within this scheme. But later prophets who used the book of Micah introduced a messianic prophecy into it. So, most famously in chapter 5. And I thought I should refer to this because it's the only part of the book of Micah that some Christians know, because it is handily quoted in the Gospel according to Matthew. "But you, Bethlehem Ephratah, who are little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth to me one is to be ruler in Israel, whose origin is from days of old." Now, this picture of there being not only a final mountain of judgment, but of there specifically being a Davidic Messiah coming from the line of King David, this represents a later domestication of the prophecy of Micah to make it fit in more easily to the claims of the Davidic dynasty in the south. Because that dynasty did survive, although in a reduced form, it did have, over the long term, an influence on prophecy, and sometimes an influence on prophetic texts. And we'll see some examples of that as we move along, and as we consider the prophet who is a preeminent example of one who, although he had absorbed the entire voice of prophecy from Israel in the north, nonetheless within Judah also supported the Davidic dynasty, namely the prophet Isaiah. I gave you the example of chapter 7 in Isaiah, again for an obvious reasons. Just as some people only know Micah 5 because it's in Matthew, so some people, they may know several texts from Isaiah, but chapter 7, Emmanuel, we sing a lot in just a few weeks. And as a result of that, there is an ineluctable identification of the Emmanuel figure with Messiah, with Jesus, proving that Handel has a lot to answer for. what's going on in the court of the Davidic dynasty at this time? What's occurred is that the king, Ahaz, has received the news that the most powerful figure of his time, whose name was Sennacherib, has determined that he, Sennacherib, is going to take Jerusalem. Now remember, this is the same Sennacherib who had already destroyed Samaria and had completed the cultural genocide of the north. Why had he not attacked Jerusalem at the same time? Why bother? Jerusalem is a much less tempting military target than Samaria was. There is less wealth. In the south, there's also a reduced proximity to major trading routes. Sennacherib viewed the conquest of Jerusalem and Judah as simply a mop-up operation, something that should not be terribly difficult. And in fact, in order to undertake this task, he decided to ally himself with a few minor rulers from the area. The response of King Ahaz, the Davidic descendant, in Jerusalem was entirely rational. He panicked totally. He attempted over the years, in fact, to make peace with the Assyrians. He went up to Assyria, visited. He saw that they had a splendid temple there and ordered that arrangements should be changed back in the temple in Jerusalem so it would look more like the temple in Assyria. From Isaiah's point of view, this was exactly the wrong policy, although he also wished to uphold the right and the obligation of the Davidic dynasty to rule according to the promise of Yahweh. And so for this reason, in order to insist that the moment now is not the time to panic, Isaiah, standing in the court of Ahaz, says, look, there's a young woman over here, an almah in Hebrew, a young woman who is just about at the age to marry. This maid shall conceive and bear a son, and shall call his name God with us, Emmanuel. He will eat curds and honey when he knows to reject the bad and choose the good. But before the lad knows to reject the bad and choose the good, the land of the two kings you are from shall be deserted. You have got instead to confront the long-term difficulty, namely dealing with Assyria and everything that Assyria represents. Now clearly, Isaiah is in a position in which he is at odds with other prophetic figures, just as Micah was, raising this question of how it is that a prophet can be identified by himself and also in the experience of others. Because Isaiah was in that position of contending prophets around him, he also provides us with the earliest first-hand account of what a prophetic commission was. How would one know that one was actually called to be a prophet? And this he sets out in the previous chapter, in chapter 6. Here, Isaiah describes being in the temple in Jerusalem. He is in the interior court where there is the principal altar, the altar of burnt offering. The incense is also pouring up, and the temple is operating as it should, as a place of sacrifice. Do you remember in the story of the Exodus how it is repeatedly described that the Israelites knew where to go because Yahweh was with them as a pillar of smoke by day and a pillar of fire by night? That imagery actually comes from the temple, which was the target of their wilderness roaming. In the temple, there was so much sacrifice, sometimes of hundreds of animals a day, during festivals of thousands of animals a day, that there was a pillar of smoke rising up from the sanctuary. And at night, after you had succeeded in building up enough of a fire to consume so much in the way of sacrifice, the result was the glow of the fire running through the mist and the fog and the smoke of the sacrifice during the course of the day. The fire never went out. I don't know if you've ever been to an ox roast. That's only one ox. Think of dealing with hundreds and then with thousands of them. Think of the moment of sacrifice at a time when you, although ordinarily a vegetarian, are surrounded by the sight and the sounds and the smell of animal flesh being cooked, in some case being burnt, of incense being consumed, of wine and blood being poured onto the altar. And it is at that moment that Isaiah said, I saw Yahweh enthroned in the space over the temple. And his train filled the temple. That is to say, the train of Yahweh's garments flow into the temple as if the smoke were really just the bottom of his train. Yahweh himself is not visible, but the temple itself is here represented as being the base of his throne. And in that position, he hears the song of fiery serpents, seraphim. Holy, holy, holy is Yahweh of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the experience of knowing that Yahweh is there, not seeing Yahweh, but knowing that Yahweh is present, causes Isaiah to say, I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, Yahweh of hosts. Everything I've been saying till now has been part of the corruption of my age. There doesn't appear to be any way in which we can be reconciled to the holiness of God. And then he says in his vision that one of those who was serving on the throne took a coal and pressed the coal to his lips. Now they're purified. Speak. Now, what makes this commission, which was a part of Isaiah's argument to the people around him, effective, is that he takes the position of those who are corrupt along with him and makes the statement that the only possibility of overcoming that corruption is to be in contact with the purity that comes from Yahweh alone. And along with that argument, there is a strong claim that this purity that makes a prophet derives from the temple. This is a very interesting change from what we've seen in northern prophecy. Amos and Hosea are not saying, they never say, listen to me because I saw God at Bethel. They were against the sanctuary at Bethel. They believed that the ritual requirements in the north as a whole were part of the injustice that they were objecting to. Isaiah understands Yahweh's presence in the temple to be a source of justice against injustice. And indeed, he believes that this is the only way in which injustice can be dealt with. The vision goes hand in hand with the nature of his prophecy. And whenever we are fortunate enough to have in a text an opening commission of the prophet in which he gives the vision or the experience that caused him to speak, we can usually see a correspondence between that scene and what he has to say. And it means that when Isaiah picks up the theme of the prophets of the north and opposes social injustice, he does so with a characteristic support of the temple in the south and the Davidic dynasty in the south. Woe, he writes in chapter 10, to those who decree iniquitous decrees and the writers who keep writing oppression, to turn aside the needy from justice and to rob the poor of my people of their right, that widows may be their spoil and that they may make the fatherless their prey. To Isaiah, those who behave in that way are opposed to the rule of the temple, opposed to the purity of Yahweh, and ultimately they're also opposed to what the Davidic dynasty should be. Part of Isaiah's position involves both the support and the criticism of the Davidic dynasty. We've just seen the example in chapter 7 that he has to tell Ahaz to stop being a wimp, to find a means of support elsewhere than in his vain effort to placate the Assyrian Empire. And in order to set up a picture of what the dynasty of David should be, Isaiah also provides us himself. This is not as in the case of Micah, where messianic ideas were attributed to the prophet. Isaiah provides himself, and for the reasons of his political location, a view of what the Messiah shall be. As when he says in chapter 11 that there shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch shall grow out of his root. Guided by the Spirit of the Lord, he writes, he shall not judge by what his eyes see or decide by what his ears hear, but with righteousness he shall judge the poor and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. It's an interesting statement. Why does justice require that this messianic figure, this anointed of the house of David, should judge with righteousness, but without the evidence of his eyes or his ears? Simple. He's not going to listen to his advisors. People in the court are going to be telling him all kinds of things. Isaiah knows that because he's been in that court. And he's calling for a time when the king will have the courage to ignore all that, not to listen to the buzzing of the bees around him, but rather to execute justice as he rightly understands it. Now, although Isaiah looks forward to that moment with great intensity, he also needed to live through a moment of crisis that appeared to be the end of Jerusalem at the hands of these same Assyrians who did not go away. That early foray to which chapter 7 refers was only repeated at a later stage. When Sennacherib was on a campaign in order to widen his holdings, especially from the seacoast of the Mediterranean and then inland towards Jerusalem, finally the effort is to take Jerusalem. Sennacherib was really happy about this campaign. I've brought along with me some photographs of the huge plates that Sennacherib had made up in order to demonstrate his mighty victory over the city of Lachish, which was quite near to Jerusalem. And side by side with these depictions of Sennacherib, which were excavated at Nineveh, we also have examples of the rounded stones that were thrown by catapults into Lachish while it was being taken at the end of the 8th century. People in Jerusalem said to themselves, uh-oh, here it goes. And in fact, the entire city was surrounded. And the military occupation sent in an interlocutor called the Rabshakeh, the secretary, who walks up to the city walls of Jerusalem and shouts up the conditions that Sennacherib is laying down. And while he's doing that, some officials from the Judean king say to him, "Would you do us a favor? Don't speak Hebrew. Let's talk the international language. Let's speak in Aramaic, because right now most people in the city don't know Hebrew. You're really going to bring down morale." And the response of the Rabshakeh is, well, shouldn't they be hearing? Shouldn't they understand what's going on? And he says, "Do not let the king deceive you, for he will not be able to deliver you. Don't listen to this saying, 'The Lord will surely deliver us.' This city, they claim, will not be given into the hand of the king of Assyria." He replies, "Don't listen. Make your peace with me and come out to me, so that you will eat of his own vine and of his own fig tree." Here is an international invader picking up the language of prophecy, trying to argue, actually, your God is on my side, so you should be giving yourselves up to me. The result of any resistance would be complete destruction. Now, the king of the time, as you might expect, was not exactly uplifted by the situation. And it appeared to be the case that there might indeed be a cave-in. Again, Isaiah is in the court. And Isaiah says, "Thus says Yahweh, do not be afraid because of the words you've heard, with which the servants of the king of Assyria have reviled me. Behold, I will put a spirit in him," in the king of Assyria. This is sort of the counter move. He has claimed that our prophets are talking about him. Yahweh says, "I'm going to put a spirit in him. And he shall hear a rumor and return to his own land, and I will make him fall by the sword in his own land." What happens? After the taking of Lachish, Sennacherib hears, we have much worse problems. We have a revolt elsewhere in the empire. We have to give up this siege and go deal with that problem. He did so, with the result that Jerusalem, for that campaign, was spared. Isaiah was vindicated. Later, Sennacherib, while in Nineveh, was the victim of a coup. and died. Isaiah's prophecy, apparently, had been correct. But he was well aware, too, that there's a strong tendency in Jerusalem at this time to believe that, therefore, nothing would ever take Jerusalem down. At a later time, there would be great rejoicing when the whole Assyrian Empire fell at Nineveh, a biblical book written by the prophet Nahum, which I won't consider in this series, but is great fun to read. I commend it to you. Extends an entire poem of Schadenfreude over the fall of Nineveh. But Nineveh is not the end of the story. And Isaiah knew this well. He saw that there were other imperial forces on the horizon. And so one of the last prophecies in his book is not one of victory, which he might well have claimed. This is in chapter 39, from verse 6. He's standing out in a field about this time of year, although it's not raining. He's looking out at the grass, at the flowers. A voice says, "Cry." And I said, "What shall I cry?" Here's another example of where prophecy comes from. A voice says, "Cry." I said, "What shall I cry?" All flesh is grass, and all its beauty is like the flower of the field. The grass withers, the flower fades, when the breath of Yahweh blows upon it. Surely the people is grass. The grass withers, the flower fades, but the word of our God will stand forever. Words that would be remembered when Jerusalem finally was taken long after the death of Isaiah. But how that happened and how prophecy responded to that unimaginable crisis, we'll have to see next week. Thank you very much. I'm happy to answer questions for as long as the Cardinal of Red Hook will allow me. Yes, please. I missed you last week, and so I make up for it this week.
Actually, what I asked you last week was, our culture today has a lot of self-proclaimed prophets, like Oprah, who absolutely believes she is a modern-day prophet. But what I noticed is that there's always an element of narcissism and duplicitousness in people who ultimately become prophets. And I wonder if it was the same in those days. For example, being one of the people, or committing your words to print. These are not just altruistic acts. There's some sort of element of egoism in that.
Mm-hmm.
So how much does egoism play in those who become prophets? That was my first question, and I'm really sorry to ask too, but the other thing I'm wondering about is the timeline. Were these books written after events happened retroactively, so that it worked out that they were more prophetic than they were?
Excellent. Thank you very much. Two questions. One is there an element of narcissism in the claim to be a prophet? And the other is, what's the timeline? That is this relatively contemporaneous composition, or is it written with the benefit of hindsight? First, on the issue of narcissism. In every period where prophecy exists, there's a certain advantage in prophecy. Let's go to the period before the written prophets, when the identity of the prophets is more like what historians of religion call a shaman. This is a great gig, because unlike most people who are peasants, you get to travel. You go from village to village, mountaintop to mountaintop. You engage in sacrifice there. You have to learn the chants of sacrifice. That's part of your oracular divination. Because people are interested in your work, they bring offerings so that the sacrifice can take place. you're going to be better off than most people in that society. At the same time, mobility comes with a certain downside. And the question is, in this period of oral prophecy, to whom exactly are you attached? To which general in Israel? To which judge who's leading the nation? Your choice is going to have an impact on just how prosperous you are. And the price of failed prophecy might very well be your life. So there's also a strong element of risk that is involved. Then as we move into the period of written prophecy and Amos, here you have someone who said that he had been in the south, that he had been an agricultural worker, and that prophecy has brought him to the north. It's difficult to see what the material benefits of prophecy were to Amos, since he was in the north, and he's a prophet who comes from the south, speaking for Yahweh, basically the southern God. Same is true in Hosea. Obviously, there's a degree of disposable wealth there because they can get scribes to write down their prophecy. But they are not elevating their position in the north. Other prophets in the north rather have the upper hand. So you can certainly say of the class of prophets, even during the period of written prophecy, that they are relatively more prosperous than the population as a whole. If you really wanted to do well, you'd just be a scribe. You know, by the time you had the skills involved to produce a book, scribing is very profitable. And no one minds, if you're a scribe, if you happen to have worked for a king who lost. You know, the king who wins will just hire you because you have a valuable trade. So side by side with the element of there being some advantages in prophecy, there is also the element of risk that is involved. In the case of a Micah, it appears that Micah was able to keep his day job in his farm because he was a landowner. Isaiah, on the other hand, lives in a very volatile period. He has access to the dynastic court. He appears to do quite well in his arguments by his account. On the other hand, we know of long stretches of time in which, in fact, the Judean kings did not accept his policies. And as a result of that, the picture of there being an element of danger in prophecy over time, and at least inconvenience, is also very clear. And we'll see some examples of active persecution once we get to Jeremiah and Ezekiel next week. Now, the timeline. The timeline of the works that we're considering, and this is why I find them interesting for our purposes right now. The timeline for the works we are considering is for those parts which don't have additions, the time of the prophet. So Amos and Hosea are talking about the period prior to the Assyrian invasion. They are calling attention to what the Assyrians can do, not to what they have done. And they actually provide us with descriptions of what they consider to be the absurd opulence of Samaria, which archaeology has confirmed. The attack of Amos for the dynasty in the north, living in ivory palaces, was assumed for a very long period of time to be some kind of prophetic hyperbole. But then the foundations of an ivory palace were actually discovered. So also in the case of Micah, Micah was wrong, right? Micah said the Assyrians are going to wipe us out. Micah simply failed as a prophet. And that's an important observation because it shows us that these works are not in the Bible because the predictions were right. Very often, the predictions are wrong, at least from the point of view of timing, and sometimes from the point of view of substance. Assyria did not get the south. Assyria should have, by all calculations of politics and military might, Micah should have been correct. And Isaiah should have been wrong. But it just happened to go the other way. But then the problem with Isaiah is that his belief that Jerusalem would never be taken proved fatal. Remember that prophecy of Isaiah that I read, where Isaiah says to the king, don't worry about Sennacherib. He's going to hear a rumor. He's going to leave. That's not the only thing in the book. There's an addition to Isaiah's prophecy. After that prophecy, and after Sennacherib does leave, we have a story, which is, by the way, very much like a story in Herodotus, where the thousands and thousands of Sennacherib's forces are besieging Jerusalem. This is maybe the story you heard. And an angel slays them in the night. And Sennacherib goes away because of this angelic intervention. Now, this is not Isaiah's prophecy. This is the work of someone who believes in the inviolability of Jerusalem, who has included it in the book of Isaiah. And sometimes those additions that seem to be the most effective at the time prove to be hostages to fortune. And so in this case. Yes, please, Bob.
Talking about Isaiah, we've heard of Isaiah 1 and Isaiah 2, and maybe Isaiah 3, I don't know. You're talking about it now. Is this the first guy?
Right. I am talking about Isaiah of the 8th century. Isaiah of Jerusalem lived during the 8th century, only refers to 8th century events in the text from 1 through 39 of the present biblical text. Sure enough, not next week, but the week after next, you are going to be introduced to the second Isaiah. And the week after that to the third as well, along with some rather other interesting personalities. But in all those cases, because I've called this prophecy the written evidence, I'm talking about the evidence which comes from the time of the composition. Yes, please.
The indestructibility of Jerusalem is not a new idea. It goes back to the covenant that Yahweh made with David. Could you expand on that?
Sure. One of the reasons for which, I didn't repeat your question. The covenant with David was raised as a precedent for what Isaiah has promised. And that's exactly the case. In the second book of Samuel, chapter 7, David says, there's something wrong here. I am living in a palace of cedar, and Yahweh's out there living in a tent. What I have to do is build him a temple. And the prophet Nathan, at the time, says to him, good idea. But then the prophet Nathan has a dream. And he goes back to David, and he says, actually, no. You're not going to build the temple, your son is. But because you offered to do this, I am going to remain with the house of David forever. Your son, I will be to as a father, he will be to me as a son, and there shall never lack one to sit on the throne of David. This is known as the Davidic covenant, because basically it's a new promise by Yahweh to David through the prophet Nathan. And it shows us why it was that in the time of Isaiah, 2 centuries later, during the 8th century, there were those in Jerusalem who thought there's always going to be a Davidic king. You don't have to tell us about a future Messiah. The one we got is just fine. He's anointed. He's a Mashiach in that sense. So that what Isaiah is doing is taking the earlier Davidic covenant and he is reframing it in terms of the justice that Yahweh demands of his people. And as a result of that, he finds himself empowered by Yahweh to criticize the Davidic king, whoever it might be, and also to look ahead to the emergence of someone from the seed of Jesse who will truly be righteous in all of his doings. The conflict between Ahaz and Isaiah is serious. Not only did Ahaz authorize the redecoration of the temple, he also took up practices of the Assyrians within Jerusalem. According to the second book of Kings, he even authorized child sacrifice. So there's no doubt of the strife between the prophet who absorbs the social justice concerns of the north and those Davidic monarchs who saw their authority as being absolute. Sure. Are there other questions? Or yes, please. Mm-hmm.
I have a question about the places where they were told to worship. Deuteronomy used that God would show them one place. Could you talk about how that changed from when they initially crossed into Canaan to how it got to Jerusalem? Did they do what they were told, and did they worship every year like they were told?
Excellent. Very good question. What should the place of worship be? We see clearly that Isaiah believes he knows the answer to that question. Isaiah believes that Jerusalem, where the temple is physically underneath the throne of God. That this is the very center of the universe. Part of the mythology was, from this place, God created the entire universe. So we are the location that is nearest to the throne of God. And in taking up this position, just as he reflects 2 Samuel 7, so Isaiah also reflects prophecies within the book of Deuteronomy, which held that Jerusalem was the only place on earth where God wanted there to be sacrifice. Now, this is a very interesting idea because, after all, within the stories of the book of Genesis, there was sacrifice at Bethel. Within the stories of the first book of Kings, there was sacrifice by prophets on other locations. Why should there be this conflict within the biblical tradition? Because there were different views. Indeed, these views were so different that it also had an influence on the practice of a feast so apparently uniform as Passover. Where are we supposed to eat the Passover? According to the book of Exodus, you're supposed to eat the Passover wherever you happen to be. You live there, you have a farm, you have a sheep, you cull the sheep out a few days in advance, you kill the sheep, you roast it, don't boil it, eat it. Don't leave anything until the morning. Beats Thanksgiving as a feast. Great. And within the book of Exodus, this is quite clearly a domestic sacrifice, something that you do at home. For that sacrifice, you are in effect a priest, right? Because you're killing the animal, you're butchering it, people you invite are eating it. According to the book of Deuteronomy, that's actually not the case. And the story of what God told Moses is changed. Moses says, in order to eat the Passover, you have to go to the place that I will choose. That's Jerusalem. Only there can you sacrifice the Passover. So that from the time that the book of Deuteronomy was accepted, the Passover became a temple sacrifice. And indeed, again, according to Deuteronomy, you not only could have a Passover sheep, because now it's a large urban and royal feast, you can have you ever heard of this? A Passover bull. Right? It's right in the book of Deuteronomy. And when the scroll of the book of Deuteronomy was discovered, the king at the time, Josiah, had the book authorized, believed that it came from Moses, and so he issued an edict that Passover was only to happen in the temple. And by the way, he also burned all the idols around Jerusalem in the place called Gehenna. He actually made Gehenna then and there as a place of fiery punishment. That's how it entered into the biblical tradition. And this led to the idea that you could only have Passover in the temple, which was not true in the book of Exodus at an earlier stage. And it's because of this contention also that to this day, Samaritan Jews celebrate Passover, no bulls, sheep only. They celebrate Passover on Mount Gerizim, right near Nablus, in present-day northern Israel. So there are, in fact, differing locations according to the tradition within the biblical text that one refers to. Well, I just got that friendly sign from the Cardinal of Red Hook, which tells me that the public, well, it's friendly now, it becomes worse as time goes on, which tells me that the time has come for us to shift to talking privately. Thank you very much indeed.